This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode 1, part 2. Welcome to the first episode of the Fertility Friday podcast, part 2 of the first episode. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility related. If you didn't get a chance to listen to the first part of this episode, it's a great place to start. I talked about what fertility awareness is, why it works, and why charting your fertile signs with fertility awareness is so awesome. Especially if fertility awareness cycle charting is new to you. This will be a really helpful episode, at least to get your feet wet and get a sense of what's happening, why it works, and what the basics of charting are. And in this second half of the episode, I'll be talking about some of the most common myths about fertility awareness and women's fertility in general. And as always, if any of the topics I'm talking about today resonate with you, or if you just want to connect with me and say hello, you can tweet me at Fertile Friday. And if you have any comments or questions about today's podcast, please stop by and leave a comment in the show notes about today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/intro. And I just want to get right into some of these myths. One of the first myths that I touched on in the first half of the episode, I feel like this myth really informs most women's choices about birth control methods and how they manage their fertility in general, is the myth that women are fertile all the time. And the reason I feel that way is because this myth is so pervasive that even if you learn about the fertility awareness methods, in a sense, most of us still subscribe to the belief that we could still get pregnant anytime, because that's what we were told from such a young age. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who was sitting in junior high school sex ed class when the teacher was saying that a woman could get pregnant on any single day and there's no safe time, whether she's on her period or whether it's any day during the cycle, any single day or any single time that she has sex, that she could get pregnant. And I feel that really sticks with it. It just really sticks with you. And there's actually only a small window of time when you can actually get pregnant. For the majority of your cycle, your body's actively killing sperm. It's like a sperm killing machine. So sperm can't really survive for more than a couple hours under the normal conditions. Your vagina is too acidic and the cervix is closed. There's just all these different reasons why sperm can't survive, and there's no egg to implant during the infertile periods of time during your cycle. But within your cycle, there is a small window, anywhere from, let's say, 5 to 7 days, depending on how many days of cervical mucus that you observe. But really, that's the only period of time that you can get pregnant. And it's the cervical mucus that plays kind of the most important and most central role in the fertility awareness method, because it's cervical mucus that keeps the sperm alive. And when you start to learn about the fertility awareness method, you learn that when you observe cervical mucus, that is when you're fertile. So on your mucus days, during the days of your cycle that you're observing cervical mucus, those are the days that you're fertile. But it really boils down to maybe a week or so, give or take, in each cycle that you're actually fertile, that you could actually conceive a child. And when you really kind of wrap your head around the fact that the rest of the cycle, it's physically impossible for you to get pregnant, it really calls into question the whole concept of needing to take a hormonal type contraceptive that offers you 24-hour, 7-day-a-week protection from your own fertility, when really there's only a small window of time that you need to really be concerned about it. So I can't help but wonder if all women knew that the fertile window was only a certain small period of time in each cycle. I really wonder if everybody knew it, if this was common knowledge and every single woman knew exactly how her cycle would work. I wonder if as many women would choose the pill. Because obviously there's not one method of birth control for everybody. And that's why we have options. And it's awesome to have as many options as we do. And I believe that it's important to be able to make informed choices. And I feel that there's a lot of women out there who, like myself, were taught that we're fertile all the time. And if that's true, then we do need the pill 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to protect us from this fertility that's all the time. But if we're only fertile for about a week or so each cycle, and that's the only period of time when we could get pregnant, then what do I need to be subjecting my body to hormones every single day for however long? And so I read this article recently on ladyclever.com, and it's called What Modern Birth Control Has Taken from Women. And so I have to read this quote because I feel like it just describes this point that I'm making perfectly. So in the article, the author says, I have in my own research heard the pill described as both using a nuclear bomb to cure the common cold and using a sledgehammer to fix a Swiss watch. And that's how I feel about it. I feel that after you learn how your cycles work, and after you learn that your fertility cycles, so you're not just fertile all the time, it comes in a cycle. So you have your period, you have some dry days, and then you have mucus days before ovulation. And then once you ovulate, the mucus dries up, and then you have, almost 2 weeks before the next period. And once you start charting your cycles, you start to see it and to see the visual and to experience it. And you start to gain more confidence and to be able to trust in the method. And then you really start to understand that there's only a small window, and you can actually get to the point where you can confidently identify it. And that throws that whole idea that we're just always fertile and we need this constant protection from our fertility. It really throws that out the window. One of the other myths that I also touched on a little bit in the first half of this show is that the fertility awareness method isn't effective. So if you Google fertility awareness and if you read some of the articles about fertility awareness, you'll often see that it's described as an ineffective method of birth control, and it's often discouraged. And I feel that it's discouraged and described that way because it's not understood well. Because I feel that if anyone is saying that the fertility awareness method itself isn't effective, I mean, if a person isn't fully informed and if they're not using the method properly and if they're not confidently able to identify when they're fertile versus when they're not fertile, and they're using it as a method of birth control, then of course it's not effective. But it's kind of the same way, like as if for instance, if I were to go on the pill and I wasn't informed about how to take it properly, and if I was missing the pill all the time, can I say that the pill isn't an effective method of birth control, or is it my understanding of how to use it that isn't effective? So what I love about the fertility awareness method and what drew me to it in the first place is that it's based in science. So it's absolutely not the same thing as the rhythm method. It's not guessing. It's not counting days. It's not saying that I ovulated on this day last month, so I should be ovulating on this day this month. What it is a daily observational method. So every day you're making observations about your 3 fertile signs. So your cervical mucus, your cervical position, and your basal body temperature. And based on your observations, what you actually see that day, then you're making a decision as to whether or not you're fertile. And then you're choosing what to do with that information. And so when it is used properly and effectively, the fertility awareness method is 99.6% effective. Because if you think about it, if you can identify the specific window of time that you could possibly conceive, and then you don't have sex during that time, then you can't get pregnant. So the fertility awareness method, when used correctly and when understood properly, is an extremely effective method of birth control. And that was absolutely one of the reasons that drew me to it in the first place. One of the other myths that I hear a lot in different ways is the myth that taking your temperature will help you to predict ovulation. So I can still remember watching soap operas when I was a kid. I'd be sitting there doing whatever, and my mom would be watching soap opera. And I remember seeing those scenes where, you'd have a woman with her thermometer in her mouth, and her husband would come home from work and she'd say, my temperature went up a degree. We need to have sex. So we want to have a baby. And so I feel that whole concept is still with us. So the idea is still out there that the temperature will help you predict ovulation. So when it comes to charting your cycles with the fertility awareness method, the basal body temperature plays a really important role. So the basal body temperature, what that means is that when you're charting your cycles, you want to get into the habit of taking your rising temperature every day. So your waking body temperature. And what that is, it's a measure of your metabolic rate. So you're measuring your resting body temperature. So you need to sleep for at least 5 hours. And before you do anything, before you get out of bed, before you take a shower, before you brush your teeth, you're going to take your temperature and then you're going to record it. And what you'll notice is once you start to record your temperature every morning as you wake up, before you ovulate, you'll notice that your temperatures, they're not going to be the same every day, but they'll fluctuate. But you'll notice that your temperatures before ovulation will fluctuate, but they'll kind of be within a certain range. And then after you ovulate, you'll see that your temperature increases. And so after ovulation, again, your temperatures aren't the same every day. They fluctuate, but you'll have one group of temperatures before ovulation that's kind of lower on your chart. And then you'll see whether it's a gradual increase or whether it's a sharp increase, but you'll see that the temperature after ovulation does increase. And then you'll have another group of temperatures that's higher. So you have one group of temperatures down here and a next group of temperatures up there. And so what that temperature, as I mentioned, is measuring is your basal metabolic rate. So it's measuring your resting body temperature. And what happens is after you ovulate, the hormone changes. And so before you ovulate, the pre-ovulatory phase is characterized by estrogen. And so as the estrogen rises, the estrogen is what triggers the different changes that you observe when you're recording your fertile signs. So estrogen stimulates the cervix to produce cervical mucus, and estrogen also softens the cervix and opens it and helps the cervix to move into a different position. And estrogen, once the levels rise high enough, triggers ovulation to happen. And then after ovulation, that's when progesterone kicks in. And as the progesterone levels rise after ovulation, the progesterone levels also raise your basal body temperature. So they raise your metabolic rate. And so you can think about it kind of like when, a mother hen sits on her eggs and keeps them warm. So your body's preparing for a baby. So it's kind of like a little incubator. So it raises the temperature a little bit just to make sure that if an egg happens to be fertilized in there, that it's going to keep the egg a little bit warmer. And so when you're taking your temperature, the temperature is not predicting anything. The temperature is telling you, yes, you've ovulated. And that's what the temperature does. Taking your temperature helps you to confirm ovulation. And so let's say, for example, that I'm taking my temperature every day. And let's say that my temperature goes up. Let's say my temperature goes up today. So today I take my temperature and I notice that it's up. And then tomorrow I take my temperature and it's still up. And I can see on my chart that I had the pattern of low temperatures and now I have the pattern of high temperatures and my temperatures are up. So the first day that my temperature goes up, that tells me that I ovulated yesterday. So the temperature goes up, that tells you that you ovulated the day before. The myth is that taking your temperature is a way for you to predict when ovulation happens. But it really isn't. It's really telling you after the fact. But the thing is that isn't actually important because with the fertility awareness method, obviously ovulation is really important. But when you're trying to conceive, which is when this myth kind of comes into play, the most important sign that you want to watch for is cervical mucus. Because it's cervical mucus that's going to keep the sperm alive long enough for the sperm to go and fertilize the egg. So instead of worrying so much and putting so much stress and focus on what day am I going to ovulate, it's actually in your best interest to focus more on mucus. To optimize your chances of getting pregnant, you just want to make sure that you're having sex on any days that you observe cervical mucus if you're trying to conceive. And this kind of ties into the next myth, which is that ovulation can happen at different times of the cycle and it can be triggered by sexual activity. And kind of like this idea that ovulation could happen spontaneously on any day. And if you happen to be really turned on by your partner, then, your body will just ovulate, just like shooting out the eggs at random. And it doesn't work like that. That's a myth. So as I mentioned already, ovulation is triggered by rising levels of estrogen. And so there's a process going on. Your body is very wise. Your body has a lot of wisdom. And ovulation doesn't happen at random as a result of being really turned on. It happens because as estrogen levels rise, eventually they rise to a certain point, and that triggers ovulation to happen. And when ovulation happens, it only happens once during each cycle. So if more than one egg is going to be released, like in the case of fraternal twins, it's actually going to happen within that same period. So there's only one day in each cycle that ovulation happens, and it's a 12 to 24 hour period that ovulation takes place. And so once ovulation has happened, as I mentioned, after ovulation, that's when the progesterone levels rise. And as the progesterone levels rise, one of the effects that progesterone has is that it shuts down any future ovulation. As progesterone levels rise, progesterone helps to dry up the cervical mucus, get that cervix back into that closed low position, and just kind of shuts everything down. So before, as your body's preparing for ovulation, estrogen's got the cervix all soft and open, and it's stimulating the cervix to release cervical mucus, and it's wet, and it's just like, come on, sperm, let's get this party started. But then after ovulation, progesterone's like, all right, that's it. Everyone's got to go. So I haven't actually been out to a club for years now, but it's kind of like that. Like when you're at a club and it's like 2 a.m. and they turn on the lights and they're like, okay, everybody get out. That's kind of what progesterone does to your cervix and to your fertility. So progesterone just shuts it all down, and it also suppresses further ovulation. After ovulation happens, that's it. You can't ovulate again. So after that 12 to 24 hour period happens, that is it. If you're using fertility awareness as a method of birth control, then once you've confirmed that you've ovulated and your temperature has stayed high for 3 days, all your fertility signs are matching up. Your temperature is high, your cervix is low and closed now, you don't have any more mucus, then you're kind of home free. Because not kind of home free, you are actually home free, because it's physically impossible to get pregnant when there's no egg to fertilize. And in addition to that, it's physically impossible to get pregnant when there's no cervical mucus present, because the sperm they can't survive. They need the cervical mucus to survive. So yeah, ovulation is like a specific event. Your body has divine wisdom that no one ever told you about. And so another myth I want to talk about is the 14-day myth. So the myth that ovulation happens on day 14 all the time. And it kind of ties in with the myth that women have 28-day cycles all the time. And it's not to say that women don't or can't ovulate on day 14. Obviously, there are women who ovulate on day 14 sometimes. But women aren't little robots it's always the same things going on. Even if a woman has fairly regular cycles and things tend to be, similar month to month, it doesn't mean that they're going to be exactly the same month to month. One of the things that you really start to notice when you start to chart your cycles and keep track of what's happening is, even if your cycles are regular, it doesn't mean it's to the day. It doesn't mean that every single month you're going to be exactly 27 days or 29 days. It means that maybe some months you're 26 days, maybe 1 month you're 30 days, maybe 1 month you're 21 days. And you never know when that's going to be. And that's why fertility awareness is so reliable and so effective, because there's no mention of counting days. Every single day you're checking your fertility signs. You're taking your temperature, you're checking to see if you have cervical mucus, and you're checking your cervical position, and you're making a decision that day. Am I fertile or not? The important thing to know is that a little fluctuation within the cycle is normal. If you have a lot of fluctuation, and if you have months where you're not ovulating and cycles that are really long, and that can be an indication of a different health issue or maybe a hormonal imbalance. But it's important to know that it is normal for your cycle not to be exactly the same every month. And with fertility awareness and using the fertility awareness method as a form of birth control, one of the challenges can be to kind of get your head out of that rhythm method thinking where, well, I know what I did last month, and kind of getting into what the fertility awareness method really is about. So it has nothing to do with what day I'm on and, oh, well, I couldn't possibly be fertile because I saw cervical mucus on day 9. And that's too early, so I couldn't possibly be fertile today. Well, if you see cervical mucus on day 9, you're actually fertile on day 9, regardless of what happened last month. Because it's not all that stuff in your head that's whether you're fertile or not. It's actually the stuff in your panties. It's actually the stuff on the tissue when you're wiping your vulva, when you're actually checking. That's what's going to tell you if you're fertile. This brings me to one of the other myths I wanted to talk about, which is kind of the myth that the app can tell you when you're fertile. So oftentimes, I was talking to a friend last week, and she mentioned to me, she said, oh, I got this great app and it tells me when I'm fertile. It's great because then it tells me what days that I could get pregnant. And when I hear things like that, I cringe. An app can't actually tell you when you're fertile. The fertility awareness method is great because it gives you that confidence. There's no element of guessing if you're using it correctly. There's a lot of apps out there that have a predictor setting. And what those apps do is they keep track of how many days your cycles have been for however long you've been using the app. And then based on the average of your cycles, it projects your fertile days. So of course it's possible that, if you shoot at random, then there's going to be times when the app happens to tell you that you're fertile on a day that you're actually fertile. But for me personally, I would rather know. And so the way to know if you're fertile or not is to actually check to see what's happening in your body. If you're using fertility awareness, you want to make sure to actually observe what's happening in your body. Your body and your knowledge of how to interpret your fertile signs, that is your best indication of fertility, not the app. So if you really want to use fertility awareness in the truest sense, you have to find an app that allows you to turn off the predictor so that you are the one that's in control and you're the one that's determining whether or not you're fertile. And that kind of brings me to the next myth, which is that the best time to have sex when you're trying for a baby is when you ovulate. And it's kind of along the same lines of that whole idea of the woman with her thermometer in her mouth saying like, oh, I'm ovulating, let's have sex. The best time to have sex when you're trying to have a baby is when you see cervical mucus. And the reason for that is because since ovulation happens only on one day, and after ovulation happens, the egg only actually lives for about 12 to 24 hours. In order for you to conceive, the sperm actually have to already be in the fallopian tubes waiting. You can kind of think of it like a party, and the sperm are already there. They're already hanging out. They're already having some drinks, and they're waiting for the egg to come. Fertilization takes place in the fallopian tubes. And so once the egg is released, the egg is kind of coming in there and she needs to be welcomed by the sperm. And that's kind of how it works. So that's why Mother Nature designed us this way. Mother Nature has a lot of divine wisdom going on. And as the estrogen levels rise, it's your body's preparation. Your body's preparing, right? It's preparing for the possibility of a pregnancy. And that's why the cervical mucus and the changes in the cervix, that's why all of those things happen before ovulation. Because the whole point is to get the sperm in there before the egg drops, so that once the egg drops, the sperm are already there. Instead of focusing so much on the day that you're ovulating and trying to have sex on the day that you're ovulating, you want to try to time sex for when you see mucus. So any day that you see mucus, that is the day that you want to have sex. And when you see mucus, that's an indication that your estrogen levels are rising. And so that does tell you that ovulation is coming. But let's say, for example, that you had a couple who really were trying their hardest to time intercourse to the day, of ovulation. If someone actually did that and they actually were able to have sex on the day of ovulation, it's very possible that they might not get pregnant, because by the time that you ovulate, the egg only lives for such a small period of time that you're kind of minimizing your chances of getting pregnant if you only are trying to have sex on that day. So that's just something to keep in mind, because it's a myth that you want to have sex on ovulation. And there's so much focus on ovulation when it comes to women when they're trying to conceive. And the focus really needs to be on cervical mucus, because it's the mucus that keeps the sperm alive long enough for them to already be hanging out at the party, waiting for the egg to come in. And so one of the other myths that I'll throw out there is that a woman can't get pregnant on her period. A little bit of background about that. When a woman is truly menstruating, and what true menstruation is true menstruation can only happen after ovulation. So true menstruation is different to the withdrawal bleeding that you experience when you're taking the pill, and it's different to any type of spotting that you might experience that is not related to ovulation. So any woman who maybe has at least can remember what her periods were like before she got on the pill, or if you're not on the pill, you can kind of identify true menstruation, how heavy or light it is, or how long the duration is, what the color of the menstrual blood is. But it's different to withdrawal bleed or anything like that. So during true menstruation, it isn't actually possible to get pregnant. However, only the first 3 days of a woman's period are considered to be true menstruation. And when a woman, especially when a woman is first starting to chart her cycles, you do want to consider your period to be fertile. And the reason for that is twofold. So one of the reasons for that is if you just recently went off the pill and you haven't had a period for a little while, you want to make sure that you're really identifying what is a true menstruation, because you may experience bleeding that's not to do with menstruation, and you want to make sure that you can confidently tell the difference between what is a true menstruation and maybe withdrawal bleed or something of the sort. The other reason is because once menstruation is over, estrogen levels can rise and start to stimulate your cervix to produce cervical mucus. And it's possible to actually have cervical mucus present in the last days of your period, depending on if you're having a short cycle or not, which you wouldn't really know. And it would be a real challenge to try to identify cervical mucus during your menstrual period. I don't think that I would be able to identify cervical mucus on my period days, mainly because I use the Diva cup, and any mucus, I wouldn't even see it. It would go right into the cup. Or if you're using a tampon or a pad, it would be a real challenge to identify any mucus. So when it comes to whether or not menstruation is fertile, it is actually possible that the last days of menstruation that you could have cervical mucus present. So especially when you're first starting to chart your cycles, you do want to consider menstruation to be fertile because of that reason. And one word of caution, I would say, one caveat when it comes to using the fertility awareness method for birth control, is that if you're just starting out, it's a good idea to give yourself at least 2 to 3 months of charting practice. So give yourself the opportunity to practice and to get used to cycle charting before you start to rely on this method for birth control. You really want to give yourself time to get a sense of how your cycles change, the cyclical nature. You want to give yourself an opportunity to learn how to identify cervical mucus and to give yourself the ability to confidently be able to identify what days you're fertile and what days you're not. And that takes a bit of time. It's not to say that it's so complicated, but it's something that I would consider to be experiential learning. And so you learn through the experience of doing it. And also when you're first starting out, it can also be beneficial to get support, whether you find a fertility awareness educator in your area, or you try to connect with somebody on Skype that can help you, especially if you have questions at the beginning. That's the caveat I'd have to say, because if you're using it for birth control, it's only effective if you're able to confidently identify when you're fertile and when you're not. And I mean, most women pick up on it fairly quickly, but when you're first starting any new skill, you might have questions, and you want to give yourself enough time to get the confidence in using it without the pressure of having it be your birth control method right away. So you want to make sure that when you're first learning it, that you are not using it as birth control yet. You want to give yourself 2 to 3 months of practice. Okay, so a couple more myths I want to go through that are really common. So one of them that I often see as well is that you can't use the fertility awareness method if you have quote unquote irregular cycles. I've touched on this a bit, and so hopefully it won't come as a surprise to you for me to say that you absolutely can use the fertility awareness method even if your cycles are not regular. And the reason I say that is because the fertility awareness method is not about using previous cycles and averaging out the number of days. It really doesn't actually matter if your cycle is irregular or not for the purpose of fertility awareness charting, because the action that you take each day is the same. So each day you're checking for cervical mucus, you're checking your fertility signs to determine whether or not you're fertile. If you see cervical mucus present, then you are fertile. If you don't see cervical mucus, then you're probably not fertile, but there's more to it than that. There's a couple of rules around it. You do have to wait a couple days after the cervical mucus has dried up to give the vagina enough time for the pH to change back to acidic. And you want to, there's a couple of rules around using the fertility awareness method for birth control just to make sure that you are using it effectively. But if your cycle happens to be really long 1 month and really short 1 month, then you would see that, you would notice when you're charting, and ultimately you would still be able to successfully use the fertility awareness method because you can tell whether or not you're fertile. It is a myth that you can only use the fertility awareness method if your cycles are super regular. Fertility awareness method, you can also use it when you're breastfeeding as an effective method. Now, it can be helpful to have a fertility awareness educator help you through that process of using the fertility awareness method during a time of breastfeeding, because that's a special charting consideration. It can be helpful to have someone assist you and show you how that works. But the action is the same. You're still checking every day for cervical mucus, but it's this daily practice of just checking to see what's happening. And every single day you kind of check in with yourself. Okay, did I see any mucus? And if you observe any cervical mucus, that means that you're fertile. So I guess that's a good thing to know, because you can use the fertility awareness method throughout your life, through different times of your life, through different phases. And regardless of whether or not your cycles are, these perfect 28-day cycles every month, the fertility awareness method, you can use it. And just to give you an example, sometimes my cycles would be 45 days from day 1 of my period until the day before my next one. And now I'll often have cycles now that are in the 30-day range, 31 days, 32 days. But I mean, technically that would fall in the category of irregular, right? Going from 45 days to 32 days. But I guess the reason I'm sharing that example is so that you can see that it can actually, no matter what length my cycle was, the tenets and the rules of the fertility awareness method were the same. And so I was still able to use the method. It still served me and it still worked for me, regardless of the different changes that I've experienced over the last 10 years. And that does include after I had my son. Throughout the time that I was breastfeeding, I was able to successfully use the fertility awareness method, again, because you're just observing, you're checking for mucus. And so when my fertility returned, I observed the cervical mucus and I was not surprised. I knew that my period was coming because I saw that my fertility had returned. I saw that the cervical mucus had come back. And when I was taking my temperatures, I knew when my period was coming. So that's just something, I guess, to think about. I hope to inspire you so that you kind of know what's possible with the fertility awareness method and what you can do with it, and the type of confidence that you can gain, and the ability to know what's happening in your body so it's not a mystery. And one of the other myths that I'll talk about today is that the fertility awareness method is the same as, say, the rhythm method, or say the same as natural family planning. So I've definitely touched on how the fertility awareness is not the rhythm method, because the rhythm method is based on averaging past cycles. And so obviously the fertility awareness method is quite a different method to that. But the myth that the fertility awareness method is kind of the same as natural family planning, so that kind of plays out in the way that people think that there's something religious to it, or that there's a religious undertone to it. And it's important to know that there is a good distinction to be made between the fertility awareness method and natural family planning. So natural family planning does tend to have a religious basis, and the tenets of them are the same. Natural family planning and fertility awareness, they both help you to determine your fertile window. So it's kind of like the same information, except that you have different options in terms of what to do about the information. So when you're learning natural family planning, you're learning to identify your fertile window, but it's abstinence based. So they're not teaching you that it's okay to, say, use a birth control method or a barrier method during the fertile window. They're essentially teaching that during the fertile window you're to abstain from all sexual contact. So, and it's often in line with religious practice. And so it's not to say that there's anything, good or bad about doing it either way, but it's important to know the distinction. So the fertility awareness method itself, it's a different interpretation of the knowledge. It's not based or rooted in any type of religious practice, and it puts the control in your hands, because it gives you the information so you know when you're fertile, and then it's up to you to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. And the final myth that I wanted to talk about today is that this myth comes into play oftentimes once women have started charting and they've started entering into the world of fertility awareness. And so the myth is that some mucus is more fertile than other mucus. And so this myth plays out. I often see comments or hear women talking about how I only saw some lotiony mucus, so it's not fertile. And the important takeaway that I hope that you take from this is that there are different types of cervical mucus. So cervical mucus can look different. And what often happens is once your estrogen levels start to rise, you'll observe that lotiony mucus. So when you're wiping, you might notice it feels smooth and it's kind of white in color, and it's not really stretchy, but it's kind of more like lotion. And it's important to know that all mucus has that alkaline pH that's optimal for sperm to survive in. And all mucus has the ability to keep sperm alive for anywhere from 3 to 5 days. So whether it's the creamy mucus or the egg white mucus, all mucus is fertile. And any day that you observe mucus is a fertile day. Now, there is a distinction to be made between peak mucus and non-peak mucus. Peak cervical mucus is clear and stretchy and lubricative, or just wet, and it just has a high water content. And so that is peak mucus. When you go to the bathroom and you go to wipe and your hand just slips super fast and you almost hit the back of the toilet because it's so slippery, that is mucus with peak qualities. And so when you're trying to conceive, to optimize your chances of conception, you'd want to be trying to have sex, especially on the days that you observe peak mucus. But the important takeaway is that you can have sex on a day with non-peak mucus, so lotiony, not so stretchy, kind of sticky, and get pregnant, because all mucus has the ability to keep sperm alive. So I hope that that's the takeaway. And you want to remove that less fertile, more fertile language from your vocabulary altogether, because it's actually just not correct. It's kind of like the same thing as saying if you're less pregnant or more pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. So when it comes to the fertility awareness method, you're either fertile or you're not. You're not more fertile or less fertile. Today is either a fertile day or it's not. And so the key as you practice and as you gain confidence and experience, you get to the point where you confidently can say, I am fertile today or I am not. And that's what we're getting at. So hopefully this information has helped you today. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast. And if you listen to both part 1 and part 2, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the introduction to the Fertility Friday podcast. I hope this has given you a good background and lots of usable information about the fertility awareness method. I hope it has intrigued you and help you to stay curious or get curious so that you're encouraged to learn more about it. And in the next show, I am so excited to be interviewing a good friend of mine. Her name is Rose Uchek, and she has been teaching the fertility awareness method to women for well over 10 years now. She is a Justice holistic reproductive health practitioner who helps women to learn to chart their cycles, interpret their fertile signs, and identify health or fertility issues that can show up in your charts when you start recording your fertile signs. And so I'm really looking forward to having her on the show. If anything that I talked about today resonated with you, if you have any questions or if you want to comment and let me know what you think, you can tweet me at Fertile Friday. You can stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/intro. And you can also find me on my Facebook page, and that's at www.facebook.com/fertilityfridays with an S. So until next time, be well and happy charting.